The main scope of our next session is going to be the PanOS firewall configuration files. I want to discuss the two types of configuration files that exist on the Palo Alto network devices. And once we go for that, we will also take a look at how to fall back to the default settings of the firewall. Okay, so the first thing we should know that is related to configuration files on the PanOS is that the firewall uses two types of configuration files in its operations. We've got what is known as the running configuration, which is basically the running-config.xml file, and this is what stores the active configuration of the system. Okay, so it means that whatever the running configuration file includes, this is already enforced by our firewall. And there is also what is known as the candidate configuration, which is stored in the memory by default. So the candidate configuration is basically acting as a container for our changes. So for instance, we start with the running config, which is what the device executes. This is the active settings. Now we make some change on the firewall, like add an interface, maybe modify an object, add a security policy rule. This configuration is gonna be added to the candidate configuration, which is once again in the memory. And this candidate configuration is inactive. Okay, so it means that it is kind of like on top, it sits on top of the running config, but it is not in effect. In order to make the changes active so they take effect, we will have to commit them. Okay, so to visualize that, we will always start with the running configuration, which is the active stuff. So active, this is what is now being enforced. Now, as we make some changes, they will be initially added to the candidate configuration. I'm gonna say CC, and this is inactive. Okay, so candidate configuration, once again, this is basically a running config plus our changes. Now, when I make a commit, it means that I am turning my candidate configuration into a new running config. So this basically means that this is being overridden, that the running config is kind of like overridden with the changes from the candidate config, and this becomes the new active configuration. So this is the result of the commit operation. But before we make a commit, we now know that the changes we made to the system on the system are inactive. Okay, also notice that as you reboot the system, or basically if there is a power outage, and the firewall is always gonna fall back to the running configuration. So even if you had some changes, even if you made some changes that were added to the candidate config, as I said, is by default in the memory. So you will lose these changes if you lose power or you reboot the system, unless you save the changes to make them act as a backup. Okay, but it's important to understand that even if you've saved the configuration changes, so kind of like get the candidate config and make a copy of it and write it on the persistent storage, like on the local firewall, possibly export it to some sort of external location, the candidate config backup is not gonna take effect when you reboot the system. So when you reboot the system, you will always fall back to the running config, which is the previous active configuration of the device. But with the changes saved, you can load them to restore the changes you made before a reboot or a power outage. So when you save the configuration files, the advantage is that you can always revert to them, fall back to them at a later point, and this is something that you will typically do when you run into some issues with the new settings, or basically for disaster recovery purposes. So it's a good idea to save configuration files, to have a copy of the running config, to often save the candidate config, so firewall changes, like maybe you have a lot of changes to make and you not necessarily want to execute those changes at once. So it's a good idea to save those changes step by step, just to make sure that you've got a copy in case something bad happens. Okay, so maybe let's take a look at the basics here. Let's go ahead and start with the GUI. Okay, admin with my password. So I am still with this topology here, just one firewall system. I'm using a Windows PC to connect to 172.16.1.10, which is the IP address of my management interface of the Palo Alto Firewall. Okay, so we should see that we are able to connect to the GUI in just a moment. So the GUI is generally made of 7 tabs. We've got the dashboard that is configured with some widgets. We can customize them. The general information, information about the administrator, system logs, application command center, which is the way how you will monitor the different applications detected in the network. And you will generally use this tab for monitoring, same as monitor for log messages, possibly threats and specific log messages. Then policies is where we will configure our policy engines. In most cases, it's going to be the security policy, obviously, the heart of the firewall, objects for different types of elements that we will then use in our configurations. Network is for routing and network settings. And finally, devices related to basic and custom settings related to the system itself. Various settings for different features. Okay, so if we now take a look at the upper portion here, the top right, we've got the commit option. It is inactive because I haven't made any changes, so this is now inactive. But they also have this down arrow, up arrow, a menu, which is where I can save the changes and revert the changes. Okay, so for instance, if we were to, let's say, go to the Objects tab, go to the Tags tab, and say that we want to add a new tag object. I'm gonna call it ext_zones, and we will make it red. So tags, this is something that we may use along with security zones. We will talk about this stuff later in some other videos. Let's just modify the configuration of this system. So I am now on the running config on this firewall. But once I click OK here, we see that ext zones is now shown under the objects and tags. So what I see on the firewall here is now the candidate config. Even though technically the firewall is running on the configuration that it does not contain the ext zones, a tag object, I can see it here in the configuration because what I see in the GUI is the candidate config. So I see the running config plus any changes that I made. Okay, I can now commit this change. When you click on the commit option, you've got the ability to preview the changes so you can see exactly what you're trying to do. In our case, we plan to modify the tag configuration. So orange stuff is what you modify. Add is when you add a totally new setting. to the config, and the red, or almost red, is what you delete. So I can preview my changes. This is running config, which is before adding a tag. And then candidate configuration, which is what I see on the GUI, is what I want to potentially activate with this commit. I can also take a look at the change summary. So it says object name, ext zones, this is a tag. The admin made the change, will be committed, yes. And I can validate the configuration change, which is going to take a while. Maybe let's wait for the validation here. And then when it says that validation is successful, we can potentially commit the change, which we will do. Since configuration is valid, so I'm going to close. And I'm going to say, OK, I want to commit. So what I have done is that I am now taking my candidate config, which is what I see on the GUI, and I am making it the active config, which is the running -config.xml. So the changes I made are now being written to the running-config.xml. Okay, now let's make one more change here. Let's add a new tag. New tag, and let's give it a different color. But this time, let's leave it in the candidate config and not make a commit. So if I not make a commit, I'm leaving this change to be part of the running config, which gives me an option to revert this change. It gives me an option to revert this change. So revert is going to be useful when you want to undo the changes you made previously. So this is an option we have. But going back to the configuration files and backups, this is something we could now save. So I can either go to the config menu and say that I want to save the changes. So again, it gives me an option to see the change summary, to preview the changes, like if I were to make a commit. And when I say save, it says that this configuration was saved to snapshot.xml. Okay, so at that point, if the firewall was to reboot or we lose power, we would still fall back to the running config, which is basically the configuration without the tag. Maybe let's do a quick revert, just to show you how it works. I'm going to make a quick revert. So I'm falling back to the running config, and this is the state of the GUI of the configuration I would see if the device was to reboot. But I would be still able to load my candidate config because I saved it. So if I go to device operations, revert to last saved configuration option. Okay, maybe let's just skip validation to speed things up. I'm going to say yes. It says configuration is being reverted. Please check the task manager for its status. You should reload the page when the task is completed. Okay, so basically when we now go back to the objects, we see that we were able to restore the candidate config changes we would normally lose if I didn't save the configuration. Now, if we go back to the device setup and operations, we also see there is an option to do the export. I can export a named configuration. So like my candidate config, like my running config, or my custom candidate configs, because you can also save the candidate configuration to the custom snapshots. I can export configuration version. Okay, so this stuff here is talking about the committed configurations. It's the revision versions. So this is snapshots, this is committed configs, and the state is basically config plus some more elements. Like for example, if you run global protect, it is also gonna include the certificates. So this is the options we have for the config export. But let's get back and talk a little bit more about the reverts. So I already showed you how reverts work. The idea here is that we will replace the candidate configuration, the current candidate configuration, which is in the memory, with the running config, which is an easy way to restore the original state, the original configuration of the device after we made some changes, typically multiple changes. Because obviously one way, if you want to undo the changes you made, one way is going to be to go to the GUI or just use the command line, delete, remove the configuration settings, undo the changes manually. But if you've made like 10, 20 changes, you may not necessarily remember exactly what you made. And if you wanna fall back to the previous version, basically the fastest way is going to be to do a revert, which is going to undo all changes you made since the last commit. So in this case, it's like we start with the running configuration, we make some changes, we end up with a candidate config, which is running config plus the changes, so let's make it red. And now when we make a revert, we start with the candidate config, which is once again RC plus changes, and this portion is what we remove, which effectively leaves us with the running configuration that we started with. So revert undoes the changes, commit activates the changes. So in this case, we go back from candidate config to the running config. This is the revert, where if this was a commit, we would go from the candidate config to a new running config. These two basically work, they have the opposite meaning. We already saw how to make the revert. You can use the config, which is how you revert to the running configuration from that menu, or you can use the revert to last saved configuration from the device setup and operations menu. You can also use this menu to revert to the running configuration over here. Okay, there is also a feature that is known as the configuration audit. Configuration audit is something that you will generally use to compare two different configuration files, two different configuration snapshots. And this is going to be useful for documentation purposes, or basically when you want to trace back changes you made, and maybe you've got some issues with the current configuration, you want to fall back, you want to see what changes were made by whom, and what was the scope of the changes. In this case, you may want to use the configuration audit basically to visualize everything that was made since the file that you are using for comparison. So if you go to device and then config audit, I can select the files over here on the bottom. I've got the local running config by default as the first file that I want to compare with, by default, local candidate config. So the changes, existing changes that were not yet committed. And I can also specify what amount of changes or just part of the configuration I want to see. So if I were to compare running config with candidate config, I would say go. It says this is the difference. This is my running config. This is my candidate config. If we select all, it is going to show me the whole configuration, all of the full version of both of the files. So you can scroll through the config line by line. Okay, so the same logic here. Green means that we added a new attack. This has not yet been committed. Okay, one last thing is going to be how to reset the original firewall settings. This is known as the factory default reset. And when you use this option, it is going to clear all configuration of your firewall. It is going to remove all configuration files, all configuration settings, and also log messages. And one way, the easiest way how you can enable this procedure is going to be to use the command line and the box system maintenance mode syntax, and then reboot the device to get into the so-called maintenance mode, where you can perform the actual reset. Okay, so let's take a look at this. The box system maintenance mode. Executing this command will disconnect the current session and reboot the system into maintenance mode. Do you want to continue? Yes. We now need to wait until the reboot finishes. And we finally got to the maintenance recovery tool. So I'm going to continue. And from here, we see that I am able to choose the factory reset.